Chapter 4 Weathering the Storm Principles and Local Implementation. On August 17, 1969, Hurricane Camille, a Category 5 storm, decimated the Mississippi Gulf Coast, leaving homes, businesses, and schools flattened. In Louisiana and Mississippi, 172 people were killed and another 150 perished in Virginia, primarily Nelson County, in flash floods. One of the strongest hurricanes in recorded history, Camille caused $1.42 billion in damages. On the day that it hit, Lamar Beatty, recently appointed new principal of Pass Christian Junior High, was in Starkville waiting to take his final exams to complete his master's degree from Mississippi State University. Beatty, like most folk living on the coastal south, had been carefully monitoring this hurricane. It first made landfall in Cuba on August 15th as a Category 2 hurricane and then returned to the Gulf. As it strengthened in intensity as it stormed across the warm Gulf waters, it appeared to be veering toward northern Florida. However, around noon on August 17th, it took a turn and began heading straight toward the Mississippi coast. Beatty's wife was in Mobile with their daughters, who was hospitalized, and their son was staying with grandparents in nearby Houston, Mississippi. Waiting anxiously in Starkville, Beatty decided to go to the highway patrol station to receive the most up-to-date reports on the storm. It was there he received the devastating news from a radio update from Civil Defense. Their team was sitting in an amphibious vehicle in 30 feet of water in the parking lot of North Street Elementary in Pass Christian. One of the highway patrolmen looked at Beatty and said, "Do you know where North Street Elementary is?" "Yes," Beatty replied. "It's 1 block from my house and on a little bit higher ground." Beatty knew he, his family, and his community were in trouble. He sat up all night at the highway patrol station, and early Monday morning made a quick visit to his advisor, who had offered him a B in the class and an exemption from the final exam. Lamar shook his hand and said, "You got a deal." When Beatty finally arrived back in Pass Christian, there was nothing left of his home. Schools were canceled until October 1st, 1969. At a principal's meeting days before school was to open, the superintendent unexpectedly announced to him, "Beatty, you're going to be the principal of the junior and the high school." Beatty's first reaction, "Sir, I'm not sure I'm ready for this." To which the superintendent replied, "Then turn in your resignation and I'll get someone who is." Beatty quickly retorted, "I'm ready." When Beatty began his principalship in October 1969, not only was he dealing with the move to a unitary desegregated school situation, but he was also trying to lead a school through the chaos left in the aftermath of Hurricane Camille. Surprisingly, the opening of schools almost 2 months later than usual and the transition to a desegregated school occurred fairly smoothly. Looking back on the events of 1969, Beatty wondered how these two significant events impacted his school district that year. If the hurricane hadn't hit, what would have happened? Would the blacks have resented having to leave their school and go to another school? I think there was probably some resentment, but that school, J.W. Randolph, was pretty much totally destroyed. Would the whites have resented having to go to what had been an all-black school? We don't know because of Hurricane Camille. Most principals in Mississippi did not face a literal storm, as did Beatty, when they first opened their doors in 69 and 70 as desegregated schools, but every principal who worked through this time of desegregation weathered his own storm, perhaps a teacher ill-prepared to teach in a diverse, heterogeneous classroom, students upset about the canceling of prom, parents dissatisfied with their child's classroom placement, overcrowded facilities, inadequate resources, vocal criticism of recently adopted discipline policies, an appearance before a district judge to defend an action taken, or a student walkout in protest of school policies. Certainly some principals endured the storm much better than others. Many white principals resigned or retired. Some did so bitterly, but others recognized it was time to turn the reins over to a new cadre of school administration ready to take on the challenges of school desegregation. William Lewis, a high school coach in 1969, vividly recalls the meeting in which the long-term principal of Harrison Central High decided to retire. Mr. Barnett was a great big fellow, had this big rough voice, and he really commanded the school and ran it his way. The way the old school guys used to run the schoolhouse, he really didn't take kindly to any interference from anybody, and the students were respectful of him, and he called us together the spring of 1969, and he said he had made the decision to retire, and I can remember the big strong gruff fellow and tears running down his cheek, and he made the statement that has always stuck with me, and I think it was really prophetic. "Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for my kind of education to come to an end," and I think he was exactly right. Waiting in the wings were a number of white men who were given an unprecedented opportunity to hone their skills as administrators at a very young age. Unfortunately, their opportunity often came in on the backs of older, more experienced black principals who did not weather the desegregation storm so well. Many of them were demoted or lost their jobs entirely. It would be at the school level that the rubber met the road in determining the implementation of desegregation and the daily work of doing school. Some principals had significant input into major decisions after affecting their schools. Others had little or no involvement in creating the district-wide desegregation plan, but were expected to explain it and enforce it. Primary challenge for many principals in working through school desegregation was that they were expected to be internal change agents responsible for enacting court orders, and HEW desegregation plans, yet their own. Authority to enact substantive change was often curtailed by the bureaucratic and hierarchical structure of the educational decision making. The Christmas break, preparing for integration in a hurry. Charles Boone was a principal at Quitman High School in Clark County, Mississippi. Like many of his fellow principals in 1969, he had received no formal training on how to lead a school through desegregation. He was jolted into reality a few weeks after the Alexander v. Holmes ruling when two men from the HEW walked into his office, handed him a book that was as thick as Sears' Roebuck catalog, and said to him, "When you open up your school after Christmas holidays, the 9th grade through the 12th grade will be in this building, and it's all in the book." They turned around and walked out. He quickly picked up his phone and called his superintendent, who said, "Yeah, I just got the same book." With little guidance from the superintendent or his school board, and the book being basically useless, Boone realized he needed to get busy and get busy soon. He called the principal at the black school and asked if he could address the student body. The principal agreed. Boone's strategy was that he would build rapport with black students by demonstrating how similar his own background was to theirs. He shared with them how he had grown up poor and had to struggle to get an education. He thought he was giving an inspirational speech about how one can work hard and overcome life's obstacles to become successful. He intentionally used we throughout his address to emphasize that they would all need to work together to make integration successful. He gave what he thought was a good citizen talk. It was an abysmal failure. When he finally stopped for a breath, 100 hands went into the air and he began addressing the current. "Will we change the school mascot? What will be our school colors? Is it true that you're going to make us cut our hair? Will I be able to take algebra? Will we get to play the basketball team come January? Who will be our teachers?" Boone tried to answer their questions as best he could, quell their fears, and dispel the rumors behind many of the questions. But he returned to his school with the realization that it would be the seemingly mundane decisions he must make that would determine whether or not desegregation would be successful at Quitman High. Boone explained that what he did during the month he had to prepare. During the Christmas holidays, many a night I'd work all day and all night. I'd come home and shave, take a bath, and put my clothes back on and go work straight without sleep at all, or maybe just an hour, trying to get ready during the Christmas holidays to open up January 7th. Boone and his assistant principal, Arthur Nelson, who was black, spent the Christmas break studying the students' current schedules, examining their cumulative folders, and determining the semester schedule for each student. Boone created a master chart to provide a visual image of the racial breakdown of each class. When he placed a white student in the class, he used a red pen. When he placed a black student in the class, he used a black pen. Boone realized that several of the black seniors transferring to this school in January were going to be a half unit short of meeting state requirement for graduation. Boone sought guidance on what he needed to do. "I called the State Department. I wanted in writing what I'm supposed to do. They didn't know. I told them, I'm going to fudge on the evidence so these kids can graduate. They said, 'Mr. Boone, we're not going to question anything you do this year.' By the end of December, Boone felt confident that he was ready for school to open. Now I've got it all set up, a new handbook, I've got everybody's schedules, and I've got teachers being in this room or that room. I've got it mathematically all worked out during that 2 weeks over Christmas holidays, met with my teachers a day early and gave them their assignment, and I'm ready to start. I'm not bragging, I'm praising the Lord. He got me through it." Boone cites his deep religious faith and daily prayer life as the reason for his success that first semester. "Everything was through prayer and what I thought was right for the kids." He specifically believes his prayers were answered in the assignment of his assistant principal, whom he did not know before the Christmas break. He describes their first encounter. "That was my first night with Mr. Nelson. I said to him, 'Well, I've got this problem, and here's what I think we ought to do.' And he would say, 'That sounds fine, Mr. Boone.' Then I would say, 'This is what I think ought to do here.' And he would say, 'That's fine.' I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I got an Uncle Tom. I don't want somebody that agrees with me on everything. I want somebody that tells me if they disagree with me. So I said, I'll outsmart this fellow. So the next problem I had, I said, 'Now how do you think we ought to handle this?' And he would think, and I would agree with him on the answer. I said, 'That's weird.' And I'd give him another problem. He said, Well, I think we ought to do this. I couldn't believe it. Two individuals, one in the black system and one in the white the system. And under an integrated calming event, we had the same goals and were trying to solve the same way. I said something's wrong. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I walked outside and I looked up and saw his car tag and on his car tag it said, Christ is the answer. Now I could take you to this graveyard right up here and show you a big tombstone, me and my wife, and across the bottom to this day it's got Christ is the answer. Tragically, Mr. Nelson and his daughter were killed the following year in a car accident. Like Charles Boone, John Allen Flint was a somewhat seasoned principal. When desegregation occurred in his school district in 1960, he began teaching in the New Hebron, Lawrence County, a small rural school housing grades 1 through 12. In 1966, he was appointed the principal and coach. When the Alexander ruling came down on October 1969, Flint began visiting the black schools to gather information about their teachers and their students. He knew he would have to have some input concerning what black teachers would be assigned to his school, so he wanted to be armed with information about their teaching. However, with Christmas break right around the corner and the superintendent providing no logistical details about the desegregation of their schools, Flint was anxious. How was he supposed to open his school doors in January as an integrated school when he did not even know who would be teaching at New Hebron or what new students would be enrolling? Finally, right before schools were to open in January, the superintendent called a meeting with all the principals. He asked them to go around the room and state their main priority in terms of teacher need. After the last person made his declaration, the superintendent stood up and told them work it out, and then left the room. The principals began vying for teachers. Flint and another principal both wanted Coach Swansea Brown at their school. Flint wanted him to teach math, the other principal wanted him to coach. At the end of the day, after much discussion and negotiation, Coach Brown was assigned to New Hebron along with eight other black teachers. Unlike Charles Boone and John Allen Flint, Jim Brewer was a brand new principal when he took over the leadership of Jefferson Middle School in Columbia, which was to open on January 7, 1970. As a desegregated school, similar to many black high schools during desegregation, Jefferson High School, the formerly all-black school, was converted to Jefferson Middles. Jefferson High was the pride of the black community, but it had been woefully under-resourced. When Jim and his superintendent took a tour of the school before Christmas break, Jim was appalled at the condition of the facilities: broken desks, unusable electrical outlets, peeling paint, and a general disrepair. The neglect of black schools and the sudden need to improve them in preparation of white students was a challenge many school districts faced as they hastily prepared for desegregation. A 1970 NEA report was about the status of the desegregation in Mississippi and Louisiana observed, a fortunate result regarded by black students with some cynicism has been the renovation and remodeling of the black schools to make them fit for white students. As noted by the earlier task force, great emphasis is placed on repainting of restrooms and locker rooms, replacing commodes, and on obliterating all emblems of school and racial identity. Brewer's first order of business as the new principal was to spruce up his school building. He asked 20 black and white high school boys to help over Christmas break. He thought it would also be a good opportunity for them to get acquainted before they began school together in January. These students volunteers helped repair the school and moved books, furniture, supplies, and equipment to the new Jefferson Middle School. Jim Brewer knew that many of the whites held lingering doubts about sending their children to a school located in an all-black neighborhood, and black parents were concerned about how their children would be treated in an integrated setting with a new white principal to help alleviate their concerns. Brewer held an open house the Sunday before the opening day of the school. To his surprise, 735 students and adults attended. As black and white parents greeted each other walking down the halls, Jim felt confident and prepared for the next day as he explained. I was fairly young and looked at it as a real challenge. To be very frank, I was excited the Sunday afternoon went down so well. The teachers were prepared, the classrooms were prepared, and I was pretty wrapped up. I didn't expect any trouble. And we didn't have any. Starkville City School Superintendent B. Hall Buchanan, or Buchanan, had spent some time trying to prepare his school personnel for desegregation. He met regularly with the principals, apprised them of the upcoming changes, and on occasion solicited input from them. Fenton Peters, who was a principal of an all-black Henderson High, described those meetings of which he was a part. It was a joint effort, preparing for what was going to happen. I was part of the process, but it was not left entirely up to me. The rules and whatnot came down from on high. Superintendent Buchanan and his assistants, the central office staff, and the school board devised and contrived a major plan and process about what was going to happen and what way we were going to do it. Now we had an administrative council. It was all the administrators that were surrounding the superintendent. And when we came up with something that we felt as professionals would probably go best or work better as opposed to that way, of course, as I said, everyone had their input. I don't know if everybody got heard. Some people got heard a little more than others did. Starkville's desegregation plan was based on grade centers using all existing school buildings. There was first and second grade school, a third grade school, and so forth. Starkville High was the only school in the district for grades 10 through 12. This grade center approach to achieving desegregation alleviated competing schools in which the black-white ratio had to be carefully monitored. Since citywide all students in one grade attended one school, the plan was effective in meeting the requirements to implementing a unitary school system. But it was not without its critics. Many members of the black community were upset about losing Henderson High, a school with a rich history and a centerpiece of the black community. Also, Benton Peters would not continue as the high school principal when the Starkville schools desegregated. He was demoted to the principal of the middle school. Making it through the first day. Was today a success? This was the question looming over every principal's head at the end of the opening day in January, February, August, or September 1970. The decisions, the all-nighters over Christmas and summer break, and the constant worry all culminated in having a successful first day. The measures for judging that success varied from school to school. For many principals, a successful first day meant no violence and few disruptions made or outside the buildings. For others, the main criterion for claiming success at the end of the day was that white students showed up. For yet others, it was that teachers were prepared. Students were in the classrooms and learning took place. High on every principal's list for a successful first day was making sure that his school opened in an orderly manner and the day was as normal as possible. Jim Brewer sought the help of parents and community members to ensure no disruptions occurred on opening day at Jefferson Middle School. He asked key members of the community to serve as hall monitors. Their job was simply to check for any disturbance or commotion and to praise students for good behavior as they changed classes or walked to and from bathrooms and the cafeteria. At the end of the day, Brewer was proud of their accomplishments. We had class on the first day, the students went to their classrooms, they knew where to go, and the teachers were teaching that first day and were extremely proud of that. Benton Peters did not know what to expect the first day of school desegregation at Armstrong Middle School in Starkville. Perhaps he was a bit preoccupied with other matters since his wife was in the hospital giving birth to their second son. He described opening day while my son was being delivered by cesarean. The superintendent and I were talking about my school making sure that nothing happened. The superintendent was touring schools to make sure as much as he could that nothing out of the way happened, that nothing went wrong and nothing did. To be honest, compared to other places, it was smooth as a dollar. I did not think it would go that smooth, but it did. It fooled me and a lot of other folks. On opening day at Beaumont High School, Perry County, a concerned white father waited outside while his daughter entered her newly desegregated school. He admitted to the local paper that perhaps desegregation may work better than he thought. However, he added, if anything happens to my girl, if she's insulted by a negra, I'll come over there and knock the hell out of Adcox. Bill Adcox, the principal of the high school, considered the man's comments indicative of a first good day and a sign of progress in the community. Last year, the same man said he would shoot me if we desegregated the school. That's good progress. The local, state, and national press was out in full force in January 1970, eager to capture the rest of the county. The drama unfolding as the state had fought Brown the longest was forced to comply with the school desegregation. Many principals had to expend considerable time and energy on the first day to keep the press at bay and out of their schools. Like most principals, Jim Brewer had no formal training on how to deal with the media, deliver a press conference, or write a press release. But Brewer quickly received a crash course in school media relations. On the morning Jefferson Middle School opened its doors as a desegregated school, Principal Brewer was dealing with two immediate concerns: determining the veracity of a rumor circulating that a band of 100 white parents was marching toward the school to protest integration and to disrupt the school day, and preventing the press from entering his school building. The rumor about the marchers proved false, but he did have to confront the media. Brewer explained that he how he dealt with the press. I had to tell him no, they couldn't come in and take pictures inside while we were having classes. No way are you going to disrupt our school. But they took pictures of the outside, and that was about it. That lasted only about 20 minutes, and they went somewhere else to take pictures. When the reporters came from the national networks, including Dan Rather, showed up at Neshoba Central High School in Philadelphia, home of the horrific murder of civil rights workers in 1964, Principal Leo Salter solicited the help of the police to keep members of the media off his campus. A few tried to force their way into the building. The police escorted them out as they and Salter exchanged shouts with press calling for First Amendment rights, and Salter replying, "You don't have any right to be here while we're having school." It took about 2 weeks for all the press to leave Neshoba County. The experience left Salter with a rather low opinion of journalists. His son, Sid, would go on to become one. Sid commented, "I think my dad would have been happier had I told him I wanted to be a horse thief than I wanted to be a journalist, because he didn't have any use for him." Larry Van Dyke did not have the luxury on a Christmas break to prepare for the first day of desegregation. He was appointed principal of Holly Springs Elementary the day before school was to open in January 1970. Larry knew he was specifically chosen for the job because he was a Yankee outsider, someone you can hate more easily. Larry was from Memphis, and he and his wife, a physician, had recently returned from Africa, where they served as missionaries for 6 months. According to Van Dyke, they approached their new jobs in Holly Springs with a religious zeal. "We were both being missionaries in our fields, and we thought it was important that we could talk and socialize with the movers and shakers in the town of Holly Springs, so we felt that there was more than just a ministry to the poor and needy. So that was where we were coming from." He met his teachers and students for the first time the morning that school opened. By then, almost all the white students and most of the white teachers had fled to the private school. However, a group of whites tried to intimidate black parents and students. Van Dyke explained, "The day we opened, there was a narrow road to the main entrance to the primary building. The cars were lined up and down. The school bus with black students could hardly get through. Of course, there was yelling and shouting and all that, but they stopped at the front door. They were hoping that the black students, wouldn't come to school if they saw all those white people there defending their school. I called the superintendent. He said, 'I know we've got it the same way at the junior high.' And the bus driver was black, which I thought was pretty brave of him to drive in. The superintendent had notified the police and the sheriff in case they needed help. Once the kids got into the school, the cars that were parked along the sides drove away. This continued for a few days." While Larry Van Dyke was trying to contend with whites parked beside his school, he was also dealing with the media determined to get some real good candid pictures of what the classroom were going to be like. He refused them entrance and tried his best to limit their contact with students or teachers. This meant that they had to make the decisions on the first day of school to cancel recess. He noted that the first few days were simply about surviving. Spare the rod, spoil the child, rethinking discipline. After the first few days, the press left and initial uncertainties were abated. Principals were faced with the real challenge of having school. Weighing heavily on both black and white patrons was the issue of discipline. They expected their principal to be first and foremost a strong disciplinarian who would establish and maintain a safe environment conducive to teaching and learning. He was also expected to allay the fears of white parents, as reported in an article in the Meridian Star on January 11, 1970. Major concern among white parents is discipline. Parents were assured the meetings at Yazoo City that any trouble would be stopped immediately. Robert Barrett, the no-nonsense principal of Natchez desegregated high school complex, told an audience of 200 black and 200 white juniors that any fight, racial or otherwise, would result in a 2-week suspension. "Your conduct must be above reproach," Barrett said. "The administration has worked 18 to 20 hours a day for weeks to get ready for the semester. We don't have time for petty problems." Despite their concerns rarely being expressed in local papers, black parents were equally concerned about discipline, and with good reason. Given the ill treatment of many black students attending schools under FOC and the elimination of black leadership in the newly integrated schools, black parents worried that their children under massive desegregation would face a hostile learning environment that threatened their children's safety, academic achievement, and emotional and physical well-being. During the early years of school desegregation, concerns about discipline were often veiled in language of cultural differences. That is, blacks and whites in the South lived in such different cultures that conflicts over appropriate school behavior would inevitably occur. School districts often held workshops for their teachers and staff to prepare them for cross-cultural differences between black and white students. Principals were expected to be the mediators when conflicts occurred, as illustrated in the following 1955 article appearing in Educational Leadership. "The principal, of course, has the responsibility for maintaining order and discipline in his school. It must be remembered that in many areas of the South we have had an effect that what amounts to almost two separate cultures developing and proceeding parallel to each other. In some instances, these cultures have not had many points of contact which can serve as a basis for integrating the youth of the two different groups into one harmonious student body. When the two cultures begin to come into contact at this common point, the public school frictions may occur. Many principals were surprised to discover during the desegregation process that black and white students in their segregated schools, in fact, held to remarkably similar expectations about student conduct when comparing the discipline policies of Quitman High to the blacks' high school. Charles Boone found the biggest difference between the two was the severity of punishment, where a policy would say you'll get a day out of school, suspension, for doing so and so. Theirs said you'll get 2 weeks off. Their rules were much, much, much more strenuous than mine. Most school districts in the throes of school desegregation devised new discipline policies in hopes that community fears and anxieties about student integration would be alleviated. Stringent and often quite detailed, these policies were widely disseminated and published in the local paper. The following excerpt from the Starkville City School System, published on September 9, 1970, in the Starkville Daily News, is representative. The following list provides specific examples of misconduct requiring immediate suspension and or expulsions. It is not intended to be a complete listing of all possible actions of breach of contract. 1. Skipping school or class and or leaving a campus without permission. 2. Fighting or provoking a fight or disturbance. 3. Possession of or use of weapons of any nature or objects that can be classified as weapons, such as knives, sharp-pointed, or blunt instruments. 4. The theft of objects belonging to individuals or any items of school property. 5. The possession or use of drugs. 6. Possession or use of fireworks in any form. 7. Possession or use of alcohol. 8. The use of vulgarity, profanity, or obscenity, whether spoken, written, or through action or implication. The discipline policy of the Vicksburg Public Schools, published in the local paper on September 3rd, 1970, went into great detail defining the many different ways in which student could violate appropriate and expected norms of behavior. For example, number 17 of the violation specifically addressed intimate associations of students. 17. Intimate association of students must be kept on an honorable and reasonable level at all times during the school day and at school functions and at school-sponsored activities. Gestures and acts beyond holding hands and arms will be considered interruptive to the learning atmosphere of the school. The first offense will call for a firm warning to the students involved and a letter to the parents. The second offense will bring about a 1-day suspension. The second offense will result in a 3-day suspension from school. The third offense will call for a 5-day suspension from school. Recognizing his community's concern about discipline, one of Charles Boone's first orders of business was to create a new student handbook he sought to help of his students. It was one of the smartest things I did in this whole integration. I met with the black girls. You think about it. Girls of the same color will ask different questions than they would if white girls were there. They'll ask different questions than they would if boys were there. They asked some pretty good questions, and a lot of my answers were, what do I need to do? I took good notes. I did it with the black boys. I did it with the white boys. Then I would put the black and white boys together and see if they had a question, and the white girls and the black girls together. So I hashed the rules out, and we cut the crossways anyway. But they taught me a lot of things that I had to solve and that I didn't know were going to be problems to work out at this time. As part of his new discipline plan, Boone required all students to wear a photo name badge at all times. If a student misbehaved, then the teacher took his or her name badge and then contacted the office. He explained here was the system. The teacher stood at the doors and dismissed students when the bell rang. They watched the hall. If a young lady walked up to you and said, "That Joy just pinched me on the behind," then the teacher walked over to that young man and said, "May I have your ID card?" Then they were called in later so not to disturb class. Like most principals, Lamar Beatty, principal at Pass Christian Junior/Senior High, took his job as head disciplinarian very seriously. He was very constantly worried that mayhem would suddenly erupt, and he would be unable to control the situation. Beatty was particularly on edge when students congregated in a place with little teacher surveillance. The pep rally was one of those angst-inducing places. I had a tendency to put a lot of pressure on myself worrying about these things that might happen that never did. You think what's the worst could happen? You could have a race riot? Man, I dreaded pep rallies, because you get a large crowd together, you know something is more likely to happen than any other time, and I used to dread those, hated them with a passion, but nothing ever happened. I don't think the kids They weren't thinking the same way I was. What B is speaking to in the above quote is the conflicting beliefs about how to manage student behavior during desegregation. On the one hand, some subscribe to the belief that if adults would just leave students alone and allow them opportunities to get to know each other, they would resolve potential conflicts on their own. Strict militaristic discipline codes would be counterproductive if the aim was to encourage black and white students to get to know each other as individuals and discover they shared many more similarities than they did differences. Potential behavior problems would be lessened because of the students' own self regulation and monitoring. On the other hand, the prevailing belief of the time was that the best way to control student behavior and actions at school or at home was by firm, heavy handed adult intervention. The old adage, spare the rod, spoil the child, dictated discipline in the most homes, both black and white in the South during this time period. Thus, corporal punishment was an expected component of any school discipline policy. Mississippi did not have an official state policy about the use of corporal punishment. In school, local school districts were free to make their own rules about whether or not it would be used and under what circumstances. Thus, paramount on everyone's mind going into school desegregation was not whether corporal punishment would be used, but rather how it would be used and who would administer it. This concern was further complicated by the South's history of whites using force and physical violence to punish and discipline blacks. Understandably, when discipline policies were adopted in the newly desegregated schools, many black parents recoiled at the thought of a white principal inflicting physical punishment on their children. Conversely, many white parents objected to the reversal of power relations and stood firm against black teachers inflicting physical punishment on their children. One common way of dealing with discipline during the transition to desegregated schools was to assign the administration of corporal punishment based on race. John Allen Flint, principal at the New Hebron, explained the district's policy. We had the rules in the county office on paddling. I would paddle the white kids, and Swansea Brown and Smith Lucas, two of the black teachers. One of them would take care of the black kids. I had a couple of black boys in my office one time, and I told them I was going to give them a paddling, so let's go get Coach Brown, and they said, why don't you do it? I didn't whip as hard as the black teachers did. A similar arrangement existed at Magnolia Junior High, where George Dale, as the principal, disciplined the white students, and the assistant principal, Inez Green, took care of the black students, as Dale describes. Mrs. Green would walk around with a long ruler. A lot of the black ninth grade students had been held back for whatever reason and were older than the ninth grade white kids, and the white kids were concerned that there were older boys, black boys, in the junior high. If one of them misbehaved, they were sent to the office of Mrs. Green. She would either make them lean over the desk and she would pop them with that long ruler. It wouldn't hurt, but I'm sure it would embarrass them to death that Mrs. Green made them grab their ankles and lean over her desk. However, sometimes central administration or principals adopted a race-neutral approach to administering discipline. When Charles George was appointed assistant principal at West Tallahatchie, his principal, Larry Garvin, put George, who was black, in charge of all the discipline. George explained why. I took care of the discipline, both white and black. The reason why I was chosen by the principal to do the discipline because everybody knew me. The whites and blacks knew me, and they felt it would be done without any difference. In other words, what was good for one was good for the other. So I paddled whites, I paddled blacks, and those that didn't want to get paddled, I gave them the opportunity. I said, now you take this paddling or you go home for 3 days. If they went home, I told them, now your parents have to bring you back. So I had some of the white parents brought their children back same way as the blacks. So when they came back, those white parents told me, now if my child does wrong, I want you to tear him up. Lamar Beatty felt that the divvying up of discipline based on race ran counter to the intentions of desegregation. Beatty had 2 assistant principals, one white and one black, working with him at Pass Christian Junior Senior High School. He explained how he intentionally implemented a different approach to discipline at his school. First thing I told him was that there will be no, you're white, you discipline the white kids. You're black, you discipline the black. No, Mr. Kirk, white AP, is to discipline grades 7 and 8, and Mr. Swanier, black AP, you've got 9 to 12. And I basically gave him all the discipline to transportation and few other minor things, and this freed me up to deal with primarily faculty and staff and everything. The pervasive belief of the time was that principals should lead their schools with a heavy hand, albeit a fair hand. No tolerance policies, particularly toward fighting, were often adopted. John Allen Flint met with his students at the still segregated New Hebron right before Christmas break and clearly laid out the discipline policy. If you get in a fight with a black student, then the two of you will be going home. Early on, his policy was tested. A white boy broke in front of a black student in the cafeteria line, and the black boy hit him. Flint suspended both of them. The white boy never returned. Lamar Beatty faced a similar situation. However, he responded differently when a white boy known as a troublemaker decided on the first day of school to start a fight with a black student. He picked the meanest, biggest black he could find and was going to whip him in front of the campus one afternoon, and he got beaten to the ground by this black kid, and I suspended the white kid, and I did not discipline the black kid, and oh lord, the you-know-what hit the fan. But everybody said that John started it, and John admitted that he started it, so he got the punishment for it. And I had problems with that family the entire year. Making judicious decisions about discipline often put white principals at odds with their white constituents, who presumed that they shared their racist beliefs. Flint explains that what happened when one of the white students refused to address his black teacher with a professional title. Some were going to hold out. I had one boy that a teacher sent to my office, a white boy. He was not going to say Miss or Mr. to any black teacher. I told him, well, go to your locker and get your books. He said, what for? Well, you're going home. You can't go to school here if you're not going to show your teacher respect. He said, give me another chance. So he went back to class. When Flint opened the doors of his new school in January, a white parent offered to buy small Dixie drinking cups so black and white students would not have to drink out of the same water fountain. Flint declined his offer, telling the father, no need, we'll make it. When Larry Box was principal of Sudeth Elementary in Starkville, a white parent was furious that black children were touching his daughter's carrot-colored hair. Box felt the children were simply demonstrating natural childlike curiosity. However, the father believed differently. He called Box one night and threatened him, if you don't stop that, I'm going to be in the bushes outside your building with a gun, and I'm going to stop it. Two areas of discipline were of particularly concern to black parents who felt their children were being unfairly targeted. The first was the classification of weapons. Concerns about safety on school campuses meant that most discipline policies of the time contained a clause that students would be suspended for possessing any object that could be classified as a weapon. This translated in many high schools to prohibitions against students bringing an afro or pit comb to school. Fenton Peters, a principal of Starkville, explains, a big afro was the style at the time, and a pit comb was made of metal, so it was considered a weapon, so black kids could not bring a pit comb to school. This ban on one type of grooming tool, while the other students were allowed a hairbrush, appeared discriminatory toward black students. The second concern was the ban of facial hair. This was particularly problematic since many of the segregated black high schools in the late 1960s allowed students to wear beards, mustaches, and goatees, while white schools typically required male students to be clean-shaven. This conflict about personal taste and appearance led to a showdown between the white principal and 41 black students at Riverside High School, Western Line School District. When the schools desegregated in 1970, the black students transferred to Riverside from O'Bannon and Glen Allen, where facial hair was permitted. However, the principal at Riverside implemented a no facial hair policy. He justified his decision as a way to prevent students who deviate from normal appearance from becoming distractions from school classroom work. In defiance of the Riverside policy and citing that mustaches were a symbol of black identity and pride, black students refused to shave. The principal suspended all of them. 3 students filed a lawsuit, and 1 week after their suspension, federal judge William Keaty ordered the reinstatement of the students and a relaxing of the enforcement of such dress codes, citing no evidence that facial hair was an academic disruption. In nearby Greenville High School, a similar incident occurred in which a former Coleman High School student was suspended for refusing to shave. Defiance of school dress codes was not unique to southern school districts undergoing desegregation in the late 1960s and 70s. This was the height of the student protest movement, and the students from California to Chicago to New York fought for the right to wear longer hair, black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, and for girls to wear shorter dresses and pants. Judgment throughout the country adjudicated dozens of dress codes and hair cases, often with conflicting rulings, but the regulations against facial hair and the classification of afro combs as weapons were not merely fights about adolescents' rights to freedoms of expression. In newly desegregated schools in the South, these were racially charged conflicts spawned by deeply ingrained beliefs and fears about black masculinity and black power, which played out in the disciplinary policies adopted in many schools. In the segregated disintegration, the loss of black principals. In the segregated South, black educators had held an esteemed position within their communities as middle-class professionals with status and some semblance of financial security. Black principals were particularly revered, as they held one of the few positions of power and leadership available to blacks during Jim Crow and often served as liaisons between the black and white communities, as described by Frederick Rogers. The principal was the man who ran the school and, in many cases, the black community. His influence in community affairs was almost without exception great. He was therefore central in community life and was indeed more knowledgeable about what was going on than anyone else. Also, as head of the black high school, he had a role in white power structure as well. This usually put him in the position of knowing more about the larger community than any other black in the black community. He was often the only black with whom influential members of the white community had anything approaching professional contact. However, with school desegregation in Mississippi, the black principal was almost entirely eliminated. He would be one of the most detrimental consequences of school desegregation. In 1970, the National Education Association, NEA, commissioned a task force to study the effects of school desegregation in 70 school districts in Mississippi and Louisiana, where they discovered was indeed bleak. What is happening in Louisiana and Mississippi schools is not integration, rather that it is disintegration. The near total disintegration of black authority in every area of the system of public education. The task force described 4 ways in which black principals had lost their status and authority. Outright demotion, facing down of the black principal schools. Retention of the title with diminution of authority, paper promotion. The loss of the black principals was not only devastating to the individuals who lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and their authority, but it was equally demoralizing to the black community as further indication that the school desegregation for which many had fought so valiantly would extol a grave price on black individuals in the black community. According to 1970 NEA testimony before a Senate committee, 5,000 principals and teachers in southern states either lost their jobs and were demoted as a result of desegregation. According to James Haney, between 67 and 70, the number of black principals in North Carolina dropped from 620 to 170. In Alabama, 250 to 40. Mississippi lost almost all of its 250 black principals. While exact figures are difficult to confirm, plenty of anecdotal data exists to confirm Adam Fairclough's poignant assertion that the main casualties of integration were the black schools and the men who had run them. In Rankin County, a black principal who was demoted to administrative assistant to the white principal at the school where the black principal was formerly in charge. In Hinds County, a black principal with more than 20 years of experience was demoted to a classroom teacher, and in Winston County, the black principals demoted to assistant principals were in name only with no authority. In Houston, Chickasaw County, Warren Cousin was demoted from principal to assistant principal in 70 to 71, despite having 10 years of experience as a principal. In 75, his assistant principal position was eliminated, and the school district failed to assign him to a principal position. In 71, senior thesis analyzing the immediate effects of Alexander ruling, Luther Munford offered additional examples. In Covington County, a black principal with a degree from Cornell was demoted to administrative assistant in the new high school when his school became a junior high. Black high school principal in Leake County was made co-principal but assigned to oversee the black side of the building, and a black high school principal in Franklin County became an elementary principal. The underlying reason why black principals lost their job during school desegregation was succinctly explained in the 1969 article in the Chicago Tribune about the attempted demotion of the black high school principal in Humphreys County, Mississippi, to assistant principal at his own school. It's traditional in Mississippi that no Negro has authority over any white. Fenton Peters was in his second year as the principal of Henderson High School, the only black high school in Starkville. When the Starkville City Schools were court-ordered to desegregate in 1970, he was quick to come to the usage of term desegregation to explain the events. The term is court-ordered desegregation. Had it not been court-ordered, it probably would not have happened till this very day. The powers that be at that time had to have a scapegoat lean on and say they made me do it, and that's how it got done. Peters was not chosen to be the principal of Starkville High. He was, however, appointed principal at Armstrong Middle School. A newspaper reporter at the time interviewed him because, according to the reporter, he was one of only a handful of black principals leading integrated schools in Mississippi during the first year of desegregation. As the principal of Henderson High School, Benton Peters had status and power in the black community. Well respected by the superintendent, Peters was part of the administrative council comprised of all the principals who met regularly with the superintendent during initial discussions about how to implement desegregation. Nevertheless, when the superintendent and his close allies were working out the desegregation plan for Starkville City Schools, which included the closing of Henderson High, where Peters was principal, he had little clout. He noted, none of our recommendations, when I say us, I mean black people at the time, they took a very few recommendations from us. Most of them came from the white community. His main charge during the planning phase was to disseminate information about the desegregation process to the black community, many of whom were incensed about the proposal closing of their beloved high school. Eventually, the superintendent decided to convert Henderson High to a junior high rather than close it. Peters found himself in the middle of this tension, being a spokesperson for the black community but having to take orders from the white power structure. In 1976, Peters was appointed principal at Starkville High, the first black principal at the high school and one of the few black men leading desegregation high schools at the time. Despite his reputation in the community as a strong educational leader, many whites were not pleased with his appointment, and he soon became the target of their wrath, Peters explained. About 3 months into my tenure, that first year, the house rumbled, shook. I went back and looked. Smoke everywhere. My mailbox had been blown up. Of course, I called the sheriff, and they came out and didn't see anybody. A couple of days later, I put a new mailbox, and it rumbled again, shook the house. This time, it was found down near the intersection. The sheriff and I were personal friends. A mailbox is federal property. The sheriff called the FBI. I told the sheriff that sounds like dynamite, but he said, Fenton, that is nothing but a cherry bomb. I said, no, a cherry bomb doesn't shake the house. I asked the FBI agent, what do you think caused this? He said, probably a blasting cap and a third stick of dynamite. Charles Nash was one of the few black men appointed lead principal during the first year of the massive desegregation. Nash was 20 years old when he began teaching science in the segregated school system of his hometown of Macomb. During his second year of teaching, he was appointed assistant principal of Bergland High School, a desegregated high school in Macomb. 2 years later, in 1968, he was appointed principal of Westbrook Elementary School. Nash was part of a team of teachers who traveled to Stanford, California, the summer of 1967 as part of an innovative program to bring distance learning to the children of Macomb. The supervisor of the Stanford program recommended Nash to be director of the program back in Macomb. However, Superintendent Julian Prince did not offer him the job. According to Nash, Prince did not think Macomb would accept a black man in a district-wide leadership position. The time wasn't right for them to choose me to direct the system-wide activity, so instead of giving me that job as coordinator, Prince offered me the job as the principal of Westbrook Elementary School. So that's how I got to be a principal. When the full-scale desegregation took place in Macomb in 1971, Nash was appointed principal of Hughes Elementary School, the school for all first graders in Macomb. It was a significantly symbolic appointment in a town with a violent racial past. Every first grader in Macomb would have as their first exposure to a principal a young black man. He describes his first year a positive experience for him, his students, and their parents. It was the best year I ever had since I've been in the academic area. Most often, I would be at the entry to welcome the children to the school in the mornings. They didn't see me as the black principal, and the parents, apparently it didn't bother them. The black children would come up and hug the principal, and the white children would come up and hug the principal. Nash was principal for 1 year before deciding to make a major change in his professional career. Two factors contributed to that decision. One, in devising the hierarchy of leadership in the newly desegregated Macomb schools, the superintendent created the position of supervising principal, to which all the elementary school principals reported. This position lessened the power and authority of the school building principals, which Nash said rubbed him the wrong way. According to the 1970 NEA Task Force report, these types of new positions were created in many districts in Louisiana and Mississippi, and in a number of districts visited, various new positions held by whites had been created since desegregation. These positions held such titles as area principal, supervising principal, and curriculum coordinator. It is widely believed by blacks that these newly titled whites constitute the real authority behind the black principals, who have been reduced to a more figurehead status. Nash also felt he was not getting paid enough for the job he was doing. He asked Superintendent Price for a raise. We had a very nice conversation. We always had a great relationship, and he said, Charles, I understand. I hear what you're saying, but I'm already paying you as much as I'm paying the most experienced principal in the school district. And he named the person who was that. He returned from his meeting, and Dr. Leonard McCullough at Mississippi State. McCullough had contacted him earlier about enrolling in a doctoral program and working for the Mississippi Educational Services Center, whose purpose was to help schools with the desegregation transition. Nash told McCullough that he was ready for the new challenge, and 2 weeks later, he packed his car and headed to Starkville. When Nash was appointed principal at Hughes Elementary, he already held a master's degree, which served him well during the transition to desegregated schools, because academic credentials were often used as justification in the throes of hastily devised desegregation plans for promoting young white assistant principals to principals. When Lamar Beatty was appointed principal at Pass Christian, his superintendent told him, Don't come back to Pass Christian in August without your master's, because if you do, we won't have a job for you. Beatty traveled to Mississippi State to complete his master's degree. Later, he learned the reason behind the superintendent's orders. I didn't know it at the time, but there was a gentleman at the black school who had been there longer than I had in the system, but he did not have a master's degree. But I think they felt like if I didn't have a master's degree, they would have to offer it to him. The demotion to assistant principal was a bitter pill for many black principals to swallow, often serving under a principal with far less experience and sometimes at the same schools where a year earlier they had served as principal. Certainly, many white principals and black assistant principals were able to forge professional relationships and work collaboratively and cooperatively through the desegregation process. Indeed, in many communities, and the white superintendents and principals desperately needed their black assistant principals to help smooth transition in desegregated schools. They were expected to serve as the bridge between the black students and the white principals, as well as between the white superintendents and school boards in the black community. Charles George was one of many black principals in Mississippi who served as an assistant principal during school desegregation, and in that role was vital to the smooth transition to school desegregation in his community. George graduated from Tougaloo College in 1957. Shortly thereafter, he received a call from the superintendent of West Tallahatchie offering him not only a job teaching, but also the position of a principal of the elementary school. So right out of college, he became both a teacher and principal. 3 years later, the superintendent appointed him assistant principal at Tutwiler High School, the black high school. In 1969, with court-enforced desegregation looming, the superintendent met with George and his principal to solicit their help in implementing a peaceful transition to desegregated schools in their district. According to George, they devised a strategy to help get their community on board. My principal and I came to the conclusion that the best thing for us to do is sit down, select some influential people in the black community and some influential whites, and let's have a dialogue. We selected a black person from every community where we had a school. We had 5 school districts, and we pulled 5 blacks from those districts. So we sat down and had dialogue, and he explained to them the integration was here. It wasn't a thing that had been spoken of and what hadn't been done. But it's here. So we went back to our different schools and began talking to our teachers and students. George met with his teachers, telling them, if you think you aren't going to be able to work in an integrated situation, we want you to say yes now, and then you may go seek employment someplace else. No black teachers left. However, when principals were appointed to newly desegregated schools, no black principals in West Tallahatchie remained as the head of a school. George explains the superintendent decided that it would be more successful as far as integration was concerned if the head person were white. He was appointed the assistant principal. Charles George was not promoted to principal until 1980. George Dale, who was principal of Magnolia Junior High and Moss Point, gives much credit to his assistant principal, Inez Green, for the success they had the first year, despite the tension citywide surrounding the school. Surrounding school desegregation. When a riot broke out at the high school, it was Mrs. Green that ensured no violence spilled out over to the junior high, Dale explains. The best thing that happened to me was in my new job as principal of Magnolia Junior High. He gave me an assistant, a black lady the name of Inez Green. Mrs. Green had been a guidance counselor at the black high school, a delightful lady who pretty much ran the black Methodist church. She knew everybody in the black community. The day of the riot at the high school, since every since we were in the black community, the black kids were leaving the campus in droves, and white parents were getting up there to pick up their kids. Mrs. Green, my assistant, walked in front of the campus as the black high school kids were coming down the street to the black neighborhood where our school was located. She said to them, "Get on down the road. Don't the first one of you get on this campus. Get on down the road and go to your house." And we had nobody come on our campus. Charles George, Dr. Charles Nash, and Dr. Fenton Peters went on to have very successful careers in education. Charles George and Dr. Fenton Peters both served as superintendents later in their careers. In 1997, Dr. Peters received the Educational Hall of Fame award presented by the Greater Starkville Development Partnership. After Charles George retired, he served on the West Tallahatchie School Board. Today, the school district's office is housed in Charles M. George Facility for Educational Services. Dr. Charles Nash now serves as the Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs at the University of Alabama System. In 2008, he was inducted into the Macomb High Hall of Fame. However, their inclusion here should not be read as the norm, as a story that with a little time all turns out well. For every George, Peters, and Nash, there were dozens of black principals who never regained their positions or status in the community. As well documented, school boards across the South closed black high schools or converted them into junior high or elementary schools. Schools that had been named for black teachers or historical figures were given new names. Rosa A. Temple in Vicksburg was changed to Vicksburg Junior High School. Black principals were demoted or given meaningless titles, as Dr. Peters poignantly noted as he described the many losses brought about by school desegregation. They gave us desegregation, but they gave it to us on their terms, so it didn't turn out like we thought it was going to be. The average Joe, doing what had to be done. Many principals, like Charles Boone, found the changes brought about through school desegregation professionally stimulating. As Boone declared, "I like a challenge, so I was excited just as I thought it was my first football game of the year. I knew it had to be done, and I knew God was on my side, and I didn't see how I could lose." For ambitious black men like Charles George, they had to wait years before they were appointed principal. Many others were never given the chance to prove themselves as administrators in charge of their own school. A number of principals simply quit, retired, or sought employment in other fields. For many who stayed, it took a tremendous emotional and physical toll. Leo Salter, the principal of Neshoba Central High School, suffered a stroke at a Rotary Club meeting while discussing upcoming desegregation efforts. He was hospitalized for several weeks. When released, he went straight back to work, telling everyone, "We're going to have school." Salter's health continued to deteriorate, and over a period of 5 years, he had 4 strokes. That's unfortunate. Unable to endure the physical stresses of the job, he retired in 1973. As his son Sid Salter notes, integration physically took all the starch out of him. Sid is proud of how his father handled school desegregation and argues that principals and teachers, like his own parents, have been sorely overlooked for their role in moving the ideal of equal educational opportunity into the reality of integrated schools. My dad got the Bronze Star, but if you asked me what I was proudest of about my father's life, it's not D-Day. It's January 1970 because he was able to go into the cauldron and have school. Did he do it perfectly? No. Did he make mistakes? Yes. Was it some of it luck? Absolutely. He'd tell you the same. There was nothing exceptional about my parents. They were just average Joe school teachers, and there were hundreds of people just like that who would get the credit for that whole exercise working. Not the politicians, but the black and white small town educators, capital E educators, who decided to have school. And that is the end of chapter 4 of Just Trying to Have School.